The bullet shattered the whiskey bottle 2 inches from Violet Jameson's trembling hand, and she knew her carefully constructed life in Deeming, New Mexico territory, was about to fall apart. It was April 1883, and the afternoon sun blazed through the dusty windows of the Silver Star Saloon, illuminating the scene like something out of a nightmare. Violet stood behind the long mahogany bar, her green eyes wide with shock as amber liquid pooled across the polished wood. The man who had fired the shot was Luther Graves, a cattle baron's son with more money than sense and a mean streak that ran bone deep. "I said pour me another drink, girl," Luther sneered, waving his revolver carelessly. "And this time, do it with a smile on that pretty face." Violet's hands shook as she reached for another bottle. She had been working at the Silver Star for 3 months now, ever since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. The previous owner of their small ranch had claimed her father, owed him money, though Violet suspected the documents were forged. With nowhere else to turn, she had taken the job serving drinks to keep herself fed and housed in the small room above the saloon. The other patrons had gone silent, watching the scene unfold with the morbid fascination of men who had seen violence before and knew they might see it again. Some looked uncomfortable, others merely interested. None moved to help. "You know what I heard about you, Miss Violet?" Luther continued, his words slurring slightly. He had been drinking since noon, celebrating some cattle deal his father had made. "I heard your daddy was a cheat and a liar. I heard he stole from half the ranchers in the territory before he finally got what was coming to him." Violet's face burned with shame and anger. Her father had been many things, but he was not a thief. He had simply been unlucky, caught in the crossfire of bigger men's ambitions. "My father was an honest man," she said quietly, pouring whiskey into a fresh glass with hands that still trembled. "He never stole from anyone." "That's not what folks say," Luther replied, leaning back in his chair with an ugly grin. "They say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Makes a man wonder what else you might do for money, working in a place like this." The implication was clear, and Violet felt her stomach turn. She had worked hard to maintain her reputation, to keep herself respectable despite her circumstances. She served drinks and nothing more, never entertaining the men who propositioned her, never giving anyone reason to speak ill of her character. But she knew how quickly rumors could spread in a town like Deeming, how easily a woman's name could be destroyed by insinuation alone. "I think you should apologize to the lady." The voice came from the doorway, low and steady, with an edge of steel beneath the calm surface. Every head in the saloon turned to see who had spoken. The man standing in the entrance was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He wore dusty trail clothes, a worn leather vest over a blue cotton shirt, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing dark hair and eyes that were currently fixed on Luther Graves with an intensity that made several men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Violet had never seen him before, and she was certain she would have remembered if she had. There was something about him that commanded attention, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with capability. "Who the hell are you?" Luther demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Name's Xavier Kane," the stranger said, stepping fully into the saloon. His boots made solid sounds on the wooden floor as he walked. "I just rode into town looking for work, and the first thing I see is a drunk waving a gun around and insulting a lady. Seems like maybe Deeming needs some civilizing." Luther's face flushed red. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. The girl and I are just having a conversation." Didn't look like much of a conversation to me, Xavier said. He moved to the bar, positioning himself between Luther and Violet without making it obvious. Looked more like a man who doesn't know how to treat a woman with respect. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Violet could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to tell this stranger to leave it alone, that defending her would only make things worse, but the words stuck in her throat. Part of her was grateful that someone had finally spoken up, even if it was dangerous. "You calling me disrespectful?" Luther stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was shorter than Xavier by several inches, but he was built like a bull, thick and solid. His hand hovered near his gun. "You know who my father is." "Don't much care," Xavier replied. "Your father could be the president himself, and it wouldn't give you the right to speak to a lady that way." Luther's eyes narrowed. "She's no lady. She's just a saloon girl." "She's a woman trying to make an honest living," Xavier said, and his voice had gone cold. "And from where I'm standing, she's got more class in her little finger than you've got in your whole body. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to apologize to Miss Violet here, and then I'm going to suggest you leave this establishment and sleep off whatever you've been drinking." For a long moment, Luther just stared at him. The other men in the saloon seemed to be holding their collective breath. Violet found herself studying Xavier's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the calm steadiness in his eyes. He didn't look like a man spoiling for a fight, but he also didn't look like a man who would back down. "You're making a big mistake," Luther finally said. "Nobody crosses my family and stays in this territory long." "I'll take my chances," Xavier replied. Luther seemed to realize he wasn't going to win this confrontation, not with the whole saloon watching. His reputation would suffer more if he backed down completely, but it would suffer even worse if he drew on this stranger and lost. Violet could see the calculation in his eyes. "This isn't over," Luther said, directing his words at both Xavier and Violet. "Not by a long shot." He holstered his gun with deliberate slowness and headed for the door, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. The bat-wing doors swung shut behind him with a bang. The tension in the room eased immediately. Several men let out breaths they had been holding. Someone called for more drinks, and the piano player in the corner tentatively resumed the tune he had been playing before Luther's outburst. Violet realized she was gripping the edge of the bar so hard her knuckles had gone white. She forced herself to relax, looking up at Xavier Kane with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but you shouldn't have done that. Luther Graves is dangerous, and his father owns half the cattle in this territory. They can make life very difficult for you." Xavier turned to face her fully, and for the first time she got a good look at his eyes. They were a deep brown, warm despite the hardness they had shown when confronting Luther. When he looked at her, she felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Some things are worth standing up for," he said simply. "No man should speak to you that way. Your name is safe as long as I'm around." The words were spoken with such quiet conviction that Violet felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, aware that showing emotion would only invite more attention. "You don't even know me," she said. "Don't need to," Xavier replied. "I know enough to see you're a decent woman in a difficult situation. And I know enough about men like Luther Graves to know someone needed to put him in his place." Violet wanted to say more, but the saloon owner, Carl Winters, appeared from the back room where he had been conveniently absent during the confrontation. He was a portly man with a shiny bald head and shrewd eyes that took in the broken bottle and the crowd of men who were now talking animatedly about what had just happened. "Miss Violet, clean up that mess," he said brusquely. "And you, stranger, If you're going to start trouble in my establishment, you can take yourself elsewhere." "Wasn't starting trouble," Xavier said mildly. "Just finishing what someone else started." Carl grunted, clearly torn between maintaining order and appreciating that someone had dealt with Luther, who was a troublesome customer on his best days. "Well, it's done now. You planning to drink or just stand there?" "I'll have a whiskey," Xavier said. "And whatever Miss Violet here wants on her break if she gets one." "I don't take breaks during business hours," Violet said quickly, not wanting to give Carl any reason to be annoyed with her. She needed this job too desperately. "Give the girl 15 minutes, Xavier said, pulling out a silver dollar and placing it on the bar. "I'll pay for her time if that's what it takes." Carl snatched up the coin, bit it to test its authenticity, and nodded. 15 minutes then, but make it outside." "I don't want you taking up space at the bar." Violet wanted to protest, but Xavier was already moving toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. She grabbed a shawl from under the bar and hurried after him, feeling the eyes of every man in the saloon on her back. Outside, the late afternoon sun was still bright, though the air had started to cool slightly. The main street of Deeming was busy with people going about their business. Wagons rolled past, kicking up dust. A group of children played some game that involved throwing stones. The distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm. Xavier led her to a bench outside the general store, a little removed from the saloon's entrance. He gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. He remained standing, his eyes scanning the street with the automatic watchfulness of a man used to keeping aware of his surroundings. "You really shouldn't have done that," Violet said again. "Luther won't forget it, and his father has influence with everyone from the sheriff to the mayor." "Let them have their influence," Xavier said. "I've dealt with powerful men before. They bleed the same as anyone else when they're in the wrong." Violet studied him more closely now that they were out of the saloon's dim interior. In the bright sunlight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weathering of his skin from years of sun and wind. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most. There was a scar along his jaw, faint but visible, and his hands bore the calluses of hard work. "Where are you from?" she asked. "You said you just rode into town." "Originally from Texas," Xavier replied. "Been moving around the territories for the past few years. Ranch work mostly, some trail driving. Heard they might be hiring at some of the spreads around here. Thought I would see if the rumors were true." "They might have been, before you made an enemy of the Graves family," Violet said with a slight smile despite her worry. "They own or have a stake in most of the big ranches." Xavier shrugged. "Then I'll find work somewhere else. I'm good with horses, decent with cattle, and I can fix just about anything that's broken. Someone will hire me." His confidence was both reassuring and concerning. Violet didn't want this stranger to suffer because he had defended her, but she also couldn't deny the small, warm glow she felt at having someone stand up for her. It had been so long since anyone had taken her side. "What about you?" Xavier asked, turning his attention fully to her. "How does a woman like you end up working in a saloon?" Violet hesitated, unsure how much to share. But there was something about Xavier that invited confidence, a sense that he would listen without judgment. "My father died 6 months ago," she said slowly. "He had a small ranch east of here, nothing much but enough to get by. After he died, a man named Harrison Steele claimed my father owed him money. He had documents, bills of sale, loan papers. I couldn't prove they were false, and I couldn't pay what he said was owed. So he took the ranch." "Steele," Xavier said, and there was something in his tone that made Violet look up sharply. "Big man, red face, always wears a black coat. You know him?" "Know of him," Xavier said grimly. He's pulled that scheme in at least 3 other territories that I know of. Forges documents, waits for a man to die, then preys on the family, usually widows or daughters who don't have the means to fight back legally. Violet felt her chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and anger. So it was false. I knew it had to be. My father kept careful records, and he never mentioned owing Steele anything. Proving it would be difficult, Xavier said. Men like Steele are careful. They usually have a lawyer or a judge in their pocket who will swear the documents are legitimate. Then there's nothing I can do, Violet said, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settle over her shoulders. The ranch is gone, and I'm working in a saloon trying to save enough money to maybe start over somewhere else. You could fight back, Xavier suggested, if you had help. Violet laughed, but there was no humor in it. Help from who? I have no family left. My mother died when I was young and I was an only child. My father had a few friends, but they all have their own problems. No one in this town is going to stand up to Harrison Steele. I would, Xavier said simply. Violet stared at him. You don't even know me. Why would you risk yourself for a stranger? Xavier was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. I had a sister, he said finally, younger than me. After our parents died, we tried to keep our family's farm going, but it was hard. She was only 17. A man came through town, smooth talker, promised her a good job in a city. I was away working when she left with him. His jaw tightened. Took me 6 months to track her down. Found her in a brothel in Denver, strung out on laudanum. She didn't even recognize me at first. Oh God, Violet whispered. Did you get her out? I tried, Xavier said. But she was too far gone. She died 3 months later from the drugs. I've spent the past 5 years making sure that, when I see someone who needs help, especially a woman in a bad situation, I don't just walk away. I don't want to live with that kind of regret again. Violet felt tears well up in her eyes, and this time she didn't try to stop them. I'm so sorry, she said. That's terrible. It's why I do what I do, Xavier said, so maybe some good can come from it. He looked at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. You shouldn't have to face men like Luther Graves or Harrison Steele alone. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you get your ranch back. I can't pay you, Violet said quickly. I barely have enough to pay for my room and meals. I'm not asking for payment, Xavier replied. I'm asking for a chance to do the right thing. Violet wanted to accept immediately, but years of being on her own had taught her caution. You said you need work. If you go after Steele, you'll make another powerful enemy. Who will hire you then? I'll figure something out, Xavier said. I always do. Before Violet could respond, the door to the saloon opened and Carl stuck his head out. Time's up, girl. Get back in here. Violet stood reluctantly. I have to go, but Mr. Kane, thank you again for what you did. I won't forget it. Just Xavier is fine, he said. And Miss Violet, I meant what I said in there. Your name is safe as long as I'm around. Think about what I offered. I'll be staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street if you want to talk more. Violet nodded and hurried back into the saloon, very aware of Xavier's eyes on her as she went. Her heart was beating faster than it should, and it wasn't just from the confrontation with Luther or the possibility of getting her ranch back. There was something about Xavier Kane that drew her in, made her want to trust him despite every cautious instinct she had developed. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Men ordered drinks. She served them, collected payment, and tried to ignore the speculative looks and whispered conversations. News of what Xavier had done was spreading through the saloon like wildfire, and by extension, it would soon spread through the whole town. Some men seemed impressed, others thought Xavier was a fool, and a few looked at Violet with new interest, as if having a man defend her honor somehow made her more desirable. It was nearly midnight when Carl finally told her she could go. Violet was exhausted, her feet aching and her head pounding from the smoke and noise. She collected her meager pay, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out the back door into the alley. The night air was cool and fresh after the stuffiness of the saloon. Stars blazed overhead in the clear desert sky, so many and so bright that they cast faint shadows. Violet stood for a moment, just breathing and trying to let the tension of the day drain away. She was about to head up the outside stairs to her room when she heard footsteps. Her heart jumped into her throat and she spun around, expecting to see Luther Graves or one of his friends. Instead, it was Xavier Kane. "Sorry," he said quickly, seeing her alarm. "Didn't mean to startle you. I wanted to make sure you got to your room safely." "You've been waiting out here all this time?" Violet asked, incredulous. "Not the whole time," Xavier admitted. "I got a room at the boarding house like I said, then came back. Figured it wouldn't hurt to keep an eye out." Violet didn't know whether to be touched or exasperated. "I've been walking home from the saloon alone for 3 months now. I know how to take care of myself." "I don't doubt it," Xavier said. "But things might be different now. Luther struck me as the type to hold a grudge, and men like that sometimes take their anger out on the easiest target." The reminder sent a chill down Violet's spine. He was right. She had been so focused on the immediate aftermath that she hadn't thought about what Luther might do later, after he had time to brood and drink more. "Would you like me to walk you up?" Xavier asked. "I promise my intentions are honorable." Violet considered refusing on principle, but the truth was she would feel safer with him nearby. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They climbed the narrow wooden stairs together, their footsteps creaking on the worn boards. Violet's room was at the end of a short hallway, barely big enough for a bed, a small dresser and a washstand. The door had a lock, but it was flimsy, the kind that could be broken with a good kick. She unlocked it and pushed the door open, then turned to face Xavier. In the dim light from the oil lamp she had left burning, his features were half in shadow, making him look both dangerous and protective at the same time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything today. You didn't have to do any of it." "Yes, I did," Xavier replied. "It's who I am." They stood there for a moment, and Violet became acutely aware of how close they were standing, how her heart was racing again for entirely different reasons than fear. Xavier was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warm and intent that made her skin tingle. "I should let you rest," he said finally, taking a step back. "But Miss Violet, please think about what I said, about helping you with your ranch. You deserve to have back what was stolen from you." "I'll think about it," Violet promised. "Good night, Xavier." "Good night," he replied. And the way he said her name, soft and careful, made her knees feel weak. She went into her room and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment to catch her breath. Through the thin wood, she could hear Xavier's footsteps retreating down the hall and then descending the stairs. Only when she could no longer hear him did she move to prepare for bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the town settling down for the night, Violet couldn't stop thinking about Xavier Kane. She had learned to be suspicious of men, to assume they always wanted something. But Xavier seemed different. The way he had defended her, the story about his sister, the offer of help with no expectation of payment, all of it spoke to a character she hadn't expected to find endearing. And beyond that, she couldn't deny the attraction she felt. It had been immediate and powerful, like a lightning strike. She barely knew him, but something in her recognized something in him, as if they were two pieces that fit together in a way she didn't fully understand yet. It was dangerous to feel this way, she told herself. She couldn't afford to be distracted by a handsome stranger, no matter how gallant he seemed. Her situation was precarious enough without adding complications. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was Xavier's face she saw, and his words that echoed in her mind. "Your name is safe as long as I'm around." The next morning dawned bright and hot, promising another scorching day. Violet rose early, washed with the tepid water in her basin, and dressed in her best day dress, a simple blue cotton that was faded but clean. She didn't have to be at the saloon until afternoon, which meant she had a few precious hours to herself. She was coming down the stairs when she saw Xavier waiting at the bottom. He had cleaned up since last night, his face freshly shaved and his hair still damp. He wore the same clothes, but they looked less dusty, and he held his hat in his hands. "Morning," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face into something younger and more open. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought maybe you could use some breakfast. There's a cafe down the street that serves decent food, or so the lady at the boarding house told me." Violet hesitated. Being seen having breakfast with a man would certainly spark talk, but then again, the whole town was probably already talking about yesterday's events. "What harm could breakfast do? That sounds nice," she said. "Thank you." The cafe was a small establishment run by a Mexican woman named Mrs. Ortega, who served generous portions of eggs, beans, tortillas, and strong coffee. It was one of Violet's favorite places, though she rarely had the money to eat there. Xavier insisted on paying, and they settled at a corner table away from the other early morning customers. "Did you sleep well?" Xavier asked as Mrs. Ortega brought their plates. "Well enough," Violet said, which was mostly true. She had slept, though her dreams had been full of confusing images and emotions. "And you, like a rock," Xavier said. "It's nice to sleep in a real bed after weeks on the trail." The boarding house might not be fancy, but it beats sleeping on the ground. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The food was excellent as always, and Violet felt her spirits lift with the simple pleasure of a good meal. She watched Xavier covertly as he ate, noting the way he handled his fork with surprising delicacy for such a rough-looking man, the way his eyes kept scanning the room as if constantly assessing potential threats. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed?" Xavier asked eventually, setting down his fork and giving her his full attention. Violet had thought of little else, though she was still uncertain. "I want my ranch back," she said slowly. "More than anything. But I don't see how it's possible. Harrison Steele has legal documents, false or not. The law is on his side." "The law maybe, but not justice," Xavier said. "And sometimes you have to go around the law to get to justice." "What do you mean?" Xavier leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I did some asking around last night. Steele lives on your old ranch now, brought in his own men to run it. But he's not there all the time. He splits his time between Deeming and several other properties. The documents he used to claim your ranch are probably kept in his office in town, above the land claims office." "You want to steal them?" Violet asked, shocked. "I want to get proof that they're forged," Xavier corrected. "If we can do that, we can take it to a federal marshal. Local law might be in Steele's pocket, but the federal government takes fraud seriously, especially land fraud. The government doesn't like people cheating on property claims." It was a dangerous plan, but Violet couldn't deny the appeal. To have her father's name cleared, to get back the land that was rightfully hers, it would be worth almost any risk. "And if we're caught?" "Then we'll be in trouble," Xavier admitted. "But I've got some experience with this sort of thing. I'm not suggesting we go in guns blazing. We'd be careful, smart about it, wait for the right opportunity." Violet took a sip of her coffee, using the time to think. Everything in her life had been taken from her: her parents, her home, her security. Working in the saloon was slowly killing her spirit. She could feel it. Every night serving drinks to men who looked at her with speculation. Every moment spent wondering when someone like Luther would go too far. It was grinding her down. Xavier was offering her a chance to fight back, to reclaim something of what she had lost. It was risky, possibly foolish, but it was also the first real hope she had felt in months. "All right," she said, meeting his eyes. "I'll help you. Tell me what I need to do." Xavier's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "First, we need to gather information. Find out Steele's schedule when his office is empty, where he keeps his important documents. You work in the saloon, so you hear things. People talk when they drink. See what you can learn." "I can do that," Violet said, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement. "What will you do?" "I'm going to get a job," Xavier said. "Preferably somewhere that lets me keep my ears open too. Maybe the livery stable or one of the smaller ranches that isn't connected to the Graves family. And I'll do some scouting, figure out the layout of buildings, best routes, that sort of thing." They finished their breakfast planning details in low voices. By the time they left the cafe, Violet felt like she had a purpose again, something beyond just surviving day to day. It was frightening but also exhilarating. As they walked back toward the saloon, Xavier suddenly took her hand, stopping her in the middle of the sidewalk. The touch sent electricity up her arm, and she looked at him in surprise. "I want you to know," he said seriously, "that whatever happens with this plan, I'm not going anywhere until I know you're safe and taken care of. You're not alone anymore, Violet. I hope you can believe that." Violet felt tears prick at her eyes for the second time in as many days. She had been alone for so long, carrying her burdens by herself, that the simple offer of companionship and support threatened to break down all her carefully constructed walls. "I believe you," she whispered. "I don't know why, but I do." Xavier squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "Good. Now go to work, and keep your eyes and ears open. I'll check in with you tonight after your shift." The day at the saloon passed slowly. Violet served drinks and smiled mechanically, but all her attention was focused on the conversations happening around her. She heard plenty about Xavier, plenty of speculation about who he was and what his intentions might be. The general consensus seemed to be that he was either very brave or very stupid to cross Luther Graves. Luther himself didn't appear, which Violet took as a bad sign. He was probably plotting some kind of revenge, though she tried not to dwell on it. She also heard some men talking about Harrison Steele, complaining about how he had bought up several properties in the area and was consolidating his holdings. One man mentioned that Steele was planning to leave for Santa Fe the following week to meet with some politicians. That could be useful information, Violet thought. If Steele was out of town, it might be easier to access his office. When her shift finally ended, she found Xavier waiting in the same spot as the night before. This time she wasn't startled, just quietly pleased to see him. "Learn anything useful?" he asked as they climbed the stairs to her room. Violet shared what she had overheard about Steele's travel plans. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "That could be our window. A week gives us time to prepare and make sure we have everything we need." They reached her door, and this time Violet invited him in without hesitation. The room was too small for both of them, really, and she was aware of the impropriety of having a man in her private space, but she trusted Xavier. That trust was growing stronger with every conversation. "I got hired at the livery stable," Xavier said, leaning against the wall since there was nowhere to sit except the bed. "Owner's an older fellow named Tom Winston. Seems like a decent sort. Says he's been needing extra help since his son moved to California. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work, and I'll hear everything that goes on in town since everyone brings their horses through there." "That's perfect," Violet said, perching on the edge of her bed. "Did you learn anything today?" "Steele's office is above the land claims building like I thought," Xavier said. "There's a main entrance from inside the building and a back stairs from the alley. I watched for a while today, saw Steele come and go twice. He keeps regular hours, arrives around 9 in the morning and leaves around 6 in the evening. There's a clerk who works for him, young fellow, but he leaves earlier, around 4. So if we went in the evening after they've both left," Violet said slowly, thinking it through, "we'd have time to search without being disturbed." "That's what I'm thinking," Xavier agreed. "Though we'll need to be sure about the timing. And we'll need to be able to pick the lock on his office door. I've got some experience with that, but it would help to know what kind of lock it is." They talked for another hour, going over possibilities and contingencies. Violet found herself watching the way Xavier's face animated when he talked, the way he listened carefully to her suggestions and didn't dismiss them just because she was a woman. It was refreshing and attractive in equal measure. When Xavier finally left, Violet lay in bed feeling more energized than she had in months. Yes, they were planning something dangerous, possibly illegal, but it was action rather than passive acceptance. And she would be doing it alongside a man who seemed to care about her welfare without expecting anything in return. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Violet worked at the saloon, listening and learning. Xavier worked at the livery, doing the same. They met each evening, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for longer conversations where they shared information and refined their plans. And with each meeting, Violet felt her attachment to Xavier growing stronger. She learned about his childhood in Texas, about the family farm he and his sister had tried to maintain after their parents died in a fever outbreak. She learned that he was 28 years old, that he had once wanted to be a teacher but couldn't afford the education, that he loved horses more than cattle because they had more personality. He told her about the places he had traveled, the people he had met, the injustices he had witnessed and sometimes fought against. In turn, she told him about her mother, who had been gentle and kind and died too young. About her father, who had tried his best to provide for her but had struggled against bad luck and hard times. About her dream of having a ranch where she could raise horses, good sturdy animals that would be sold to families rather than just for work. "That's a good dream," Xavier said one evening. They were sitting on the bench outside the general store again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "If we get your ranch back, you could make it happen." "If we get it back, you mean when?" Violet corrected with a smile. "You've made me start believing it's possible." Xavier turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Violet, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "When I came to Deeming, I was just passing through. I wasn't planning to stay more than a few days. But then I met you, and everything changed. I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel like I've been looking for you my whole life without knowing it." Violet's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Xavier, You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know. Whatever happens with Steele, whatever happens after, I want to be part of your life, if you'll have me." Violet reached out and took his hand, weaving her fingers through his. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. I've been alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have someone care." "You'll never have to be alone again," Xavier promised. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so sweet and old-fashioned that it made her want to cry. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat together as the sun finished setting and the stars began to appear, hands clasped, shoulders touching. Violet felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years, a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. But peace, as she was about to learn, could be very fragile. 2 days later, Luther Graves made his move. Violet was working the afternoon shift, serving drinks to a group of card players, when Luther walked in with 3 of his friends. They were all armed, all wearing the arrogant expressions of men who believed they owned the town. Violet's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral and continued working. Maybe Luther would just drink and leave her alone. She should have known better. "Well, well," Luther said loudly, making sure everyone in the saloon could hear him. "If it isn't Miss High and Mighty Violet. Tell me, where's that boyfriend of yours today? The drifter who likes to play hero?" Violet ignored him, focusing on pouring whiskey for one of the card players. Her hands were steady despite the fear coiling in her belly. Luther walked up to the bar and leaned against it, deliberately invading her space. He reeked of sweat and alcohol. "I asked you a question, girl." "He's not my boyfriend," Violet said quietly, keeping her eyes down. "And I don't know where he is. Now please, I have work to do." "You think you're too good to talk to me?" Luther demanded. His voice was rising, drawing more attention. "You think having some saddle tramp defend you makes you respectable? Everyone knows what you are. You're a saloon girl, and we all know what that means." The insult was clear, and Violet felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. Several men around the saloon shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to cross Luther without Xavier there to back them up. "I serve drinks," Violet said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "Nothing more. If you've come here to drink, then order something. Otherwise, please leave me alone." Luther reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight. "I'll leave you alone when I'm good and ready. You need to learn some respect, and I think maybe I'm the one to teach it to you." Violet tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Fear spiked through her, sharp and cold. Where was Carl? Why wasn't anyone stopping this? Let her go. The voice came from the doorway again, but this time Violet had never been happier to hear it. Xavier stood there, his expression dark and dangerous. He must have seen Luther enter the saloon and followed. Luther released Violet's wrist and turned to face Xavier. "I was hoping you'd show up," he said with an ugly grin. "Saved me the trouble of finding you." "That's so," Xavier said, walking forward slowly. Violet noticed that his hand hovered near his gun, not touching it but ready. "Well, here I am." "Now you want to tell me why you're putting your hands on Miss Violet." "I'm teaching her some manners," Luther said. "Something her daddy clearly never got around to before he died. But then again, from what I hear, he was too busy stealing from honest men to care much about raising his daughter right." Xavier's jaw tightened. "You need to stop talking about her father. You need to stop talking about her at all. And you need to get out of this saloon right now." "Or what?" Luther challenged. "You going to make me, Drifter?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Violet wanted to scream at both of them to stop, that this wasn't worth fighting over, but she knew it would do no good. This confrontation had been building since that first day, and now it was going to reach its conclusion. "I'll do whatever I have to do to keep her safe," Xavier said. "That's a promise." Luther laughed. "Big words from a man with no backup and no future in this town. You know what? I'm getting tired of this. Why don't we settle this properly? You and me outside right now, unless you're too scared to face me without an audience." It was a challenge Xavier couldn't back down from without looking like a coward, and they both knew it. Violet wanted to protest, to tell Xavier not to do it, but before she could speak, he nodded. "All right," Xavier said. "Outside. But this ends today one way or another. After this, you leave Miss Violet alone. You leave her father's name alone. You find some other way to entertain yourself." "Sure," Luther agreed, but Violet could see the lie in his eyes. He had no intention of leaving things alone. He was planning something, some way to hurt Xavier and by extension her. The entire saloon emptied out into the street to watch the fight. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Violet wanted to stop it but felt powerless. Carl had a hand on her arm, keeping her from rushing forward, and she could only watch as Xavier and Luther faced each other in the dusty street. "How do you want to do this?" Xavier asked. "Fists or guns?" "Fists," Luther said, and Violet felt a small measure of relief. At least no one would die. "I want to feel it when I beat you into the dirt." They both removed their gun belts, handing them to friends. Luther's friends took his guns with eager grins. Tom Winston from the livery stable had come running when he heard about the fight, and he took Xavier's weapons with a worried expression. "Be careful, son," Tom said quietly. "Luther's got a mean streak and he doesn't fight fair." Xavier just nodded and stepped into the middle of the street. Luther did the same, and for a moment they just circled each other, looking for an opening. Luther struck first, a heavy swing that would have broken Xavier's jaw if it had connected. But Xavier was faster than he looked, ducking under the blow and landing a solid punch to Luther's ribs. The bigger man grunted but didn't go down. They traded blows for several minutes, and it quickly became clear that while Luther was bigger and stronger, Xavier was faster and more skilled. He landed 3 punches for every one of Luther's, and he was careful to avoid the haymakers that could end the fight if they connected. The crowd was cheering, some for Luther, some for Xavier. Violet couldn't cheer, could barely breathe. She watched Xavier fight with tears streaming down her face, terrified that he was going to get hurt because of her. Luther was getting frustrated. His face was bloody from a cut above his eye, and he was breathing hard. Xavier looked battered but still steady, still in control. That's when Luther proved Tom right about not fighting fair. When Xavier moved in close for another combination of punches, Luther suddenly grabbed him and threw him toward the hitching post. Xavier hit it hard, the wood cracking under the impact, and went down on one knee. Before he could recover, Luther kicked him in the ribs, then again in the back. The crowd's cheering turned to angry shouts. This wasn't a fair fight anymore. This was assault. Xavier rolled away from the next kick and came up swinging. He caught Luther with an uppercut that snapped the bigger man's head back, followed by a series of body blows that had Luther staggering. The crowd was roaring now, sensing the end of the fight. Luther tried one more time to grab Xavier, but Xavier sidestepped and used Luther's momentum against him, sending him sprawling face first into the dirt. Before Luther could rise, Xavier was on him, one knee in his back and his arm twisted behind him. "Yield," Xavier said, breathing hard. "It's over." Luther struggled for a moment, then went still. "I yield," he gasped out. Xavier released him and stood up, swaying slightly. His face was bruised and bloody, his shirt torn, but he was standing. Luther remained in the dirt, his pride as damaged as his face. Violet broke free from Carl's grip and ran to Xavier, her hands fluttering over him uncertainly. "Are you all right? You're hurt. We need to get you to the doctor." "I'm fine," Xavier said, though he winced when she touched his ribs. "Nothing broken, just bruised." Luther's friends helped him to his feet. He looked around at the crowd with hatred in his eyes, then fixed his gaze on Xavier and Violet. "This isn't over," he said, spitting blood into the dust. "My father will hear about this." "Let him hear," Xavier said wearily. "I'm not scared of your father, and I'm not scared of you. Now honor your word and leave Miss Violet alone." Luther didn't respond, just let his friends lead him away toward the saloon. The crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their businesses or homes. already turning the fight into a story they would tell. Tom Winston clapped Xavier on the shoulder carefully, mindful of his injuries. "That was well done, son. You gave him more chances to back down than he deserved." "Thanks, Tom," Xavier said. "I appreciate you holding my guns." "Anytime," the older man said. He tipped his hat to Violet and headed back to the livery. Violet and Xavier were left standing in the street, surrounded by the settling dust and the fading sunlight. She took his arm gently. "Come on. Let's get you cleaned up. I have supplies in my room." They climbed the stairs slowly, Xavier moving stiffly from his injuries. Once in Violet's small room, she had him sit on the bed while she fetched water and clean cloths. She worked carefully, cleaning the blood from his face and hands, checking for serious injuries. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly as she dabbed at a cut above his eyebrow. "You didn't have to fight him." "Yes, I did," Xavier replied. He caught her hand, stilling her ministrations. "He was hurting you, threatening you. I meant what I said before. Your name is safe as long as I'm around. That means protecting you from men like Luther." Violet set down the cloth and looked at him, really looked at him. His face was a mess of bruises and cuts, but his eyes were clear and steady, filled with determination and something else, something that made her heart race. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "But I wasn't," Xavier said. "And now Luther knows I'm serious. Maybe he'll actually leave you alone now. And if he doesn't, then we'll deal with it," Xavier said. "Together." The word "together" resonated in Violet's chest. She had been alone for so long that the concept felt almost foreign but also deeply appealing. To have someone by her side, someone who cared enough to risk themselves for her, it was more than she had dared to hope for. Without fully thinking about it, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was tentative at first, just a soft press of lips, but when Xavier responded, pulling her closer despite his injuries, the kiss deepened into something urgent and meaningful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Violet," he said quietly. "I know it's soon, and maybe you're not ready to hear it, but it's true. I think I've been falling for you since the moment I walked into that saloon and saw you standing there with fear and courage in equal measure." Violet felt tears spill over, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I can't help it. You've given me hope again, Xavier. You've made me feel like life might be worth living again." They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. Violet knew that this man, this cowboy who had ridden into her life and defended her honor, was the one she wanted to spend her life with. It was fast, maybe even reckless, but it felt absolutely right. Eventually, Xavier pulled back with a rueful smile. "As much as I would love to stay here with you, I should probably go before we give the gossips more to talk about." Violet laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "You're probably right, but Xavier, thank you for everything." "No thanks necessary," Xavier said. He stood up carefully, testing his injuries. "I'll come by tomorrow. We still have a ranch to get back, remember?" "I remember," Violet said. "Be careful going back to the boarding house. Luther's friends might be looking for you." "I'll be careful," Xavier promised. He kissed her one more time, soft and sweet, then left. Violet touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. Her life had changed so dramatically in just a few days. She had gone from feeling hopeless and alone to being in love and planning to fight for her future. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next few days passed in a blur of careful planning and stolen moments together. Xavier continued working at the livery while also scouting out Steele's office and working out the logistics of their plan. Violet continued at the saloon, though several people noticed the change in her demeanor. She smiled more, carried herself with more confidence, and didn't let the crude comments from customers bother her as much. Luther had indeed stayed away from the saloon, though Violet heard through gossip that his father was furious about the fight. Luther's face was apparently quite bruised, and his pride even more so. There were whispers that Old Man Graves was considering hiring men to teach Xavier a lesson, but nothing had come of it yet. Harrison Steele left for Santa Fe as scheduled, giving them their window. On the evening of his departure, Violet and Xavier met in the alley behind the land claims office. It was nearly dark, the last light fading from the sky. Violet's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "Are you sure about this?" Xavier asked one final time. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Violet said firmly. "This is my chance to get my life back. I'm not going to waste it." Xavier nodded and pulled out his lock picks. They were simple tools, just bent pieces of wire, but in his hands they worked like magic. It took him less than 2 minutes to open the back door that led to the upstairs offices. They climbed the stairs in darkness, moving as quietly as possible. The building was empty, everyone having gone home for the evening, but they couldn't afford to take chances. Xavier picked the lock on Steele's office door with the same efficiency, and then they were inside. Moonlight through the window provided just enough illumination to see by. Steele's office was well appointed, with a large desk, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with ledgers and document boxes. "Where to even begin, you take the desk," Xavier whispered. "I'll check the filing cabinets." They worked quickly and quietly, searching through papers and documents. Violet's hands shook as she rifled through the desk drawers, trying to be careful not to disturb things too much. They needed to find the forged documents, but they also needed to leave no sign they had been here. After 20 minutes of searching, Violet was starting to despair. There were so many papers, and most of them were legitimate business documents. How were they supposed to find the specific ones relating to her ranch? Then Xavier made a soft sound of triumph. "Violet, over here." She hurried to where he stood by one of the filing cabinets. He had found a locked box inside one of the drawers, a small metal strong box that had required another few minutes with his picks to open. Inside were several bundles of documents, all tied with string. They carried the box to the window where the moonlight was stronger. Xavier carefully untied one of the bundles and began examining the papers. Even in the dim light, Violet could see her father's name on several of them. "These are the loan documents Steele used to claim your ranch," Xavier said quietly. "And look here at the dates." Violet looked where he was pointing. The dates on the supposed loan documents were from various times over the past 5 years, but something about them looked wrong. The ink was too fresh, too uniform. And when Xavier held one of the papers up to the moonlight, Violet could see something that made her gasp. "It's a forgery," she breathed. "Look at the watermark. That paper wasn't even manufactured until 2 years ago, but this document is supposedly from 5 years back." "Exactly," Xavier said grimly. "And these signatures, they're all in the same hand. Whoever forged these didn't even try very hard to make them look different. They found similar problems with all the documents in the box. Dates that didn't match paper ages, signatures that were obviously copied, even a few places where the forger had made spelling mistakes in her father's name. It was sloppy work, which suggested that Steele had been so confident in his power that he hadn't bothered to be careful. "We need to take these," Xavier said. "All of them. This is evidence that could put Steele in prison." They carefully bundled the documents back up and put them in the leather satchel Xavier had brought. Then they returned everything else to how it had been, locked the filing cabinet and the desk, and slipped back out of the office. Their return trip down the dark stairs and out the back door felt like it took hours. though it was probably only minutes. Every sound made Violet jump. Every shadow seemed to hide potential witnesses. But they made it back to the alley without incident, and then they were hurrying through the back streets of Deeming toward the boarding house. Only when they were safely in Xavier's room with the door locked did Violet finally allow herself to relax. Her legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the room's single chair. Xavier lit a lamp and spread the documents out on the small table. "We did it," she said, still hardly believing it. "We actually did it." "We did," Xavier agreed. He was examining the papers again, his expression serious. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to take these to the telegraph office and send word to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. He'll want to see these in person, but this should be enough to start an investigation." "What if Steele gets away before the marshal can arrest him?" Violet worried. "He won't," Xavier said confidently. "Steele doesn't know we have these. He won't have any reason to run. By the time he realizes what's happened, it'll be too late." They talked for another hour, making plans for what would come next. If the marshal confirmed the forgeries and arrested Steele, the ranch would revert to Violet as her father's heir. She would need to hire someone to help run it, at least at first, since she didn't have experience managing ranch hands. But it was her land, her legacy, and soon it would be back in her possession. Before Violet left to return to her own room, Xavier pulled her into his arms. "You're amazing," he said softly. "Brave and smart and beautiful. I'm so glad I found you." "I'm glad you found me too," Violet said, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating steady and strong. "I love you, Xavier." "I love you too," he replied. "And as soon as we get your ranch back, as soon as things are settled, I'm going to ask you properly to marry me, with a ring and everything." Violet looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "You don't need a ring. The answer is already yes." Xavier smiled, that wonderful smile that transformed his whole face, and kissed her. "I'm still going to get you a ring," he said. "You deserve something beautiful." Violet floated back to her room that night, too happy to sleep. Everything was falling into place. They had the evidence they needed. Xavier loved her and wanted to marry her, and soon she would have her ranch back. It was almost too good to be true. She should have remembered that when things seemed too good to be true, they usually were. The next morning, Violet woke early and dressed quickly, eager to see Xavier and hear how his visit to the telegraph office had gone. She was just about to leave her room when she heard shouting from the street below. Curious and a little worried, she looked out her window. What she saw made her blood run cold. A group of men on horseback had surrounded the boarding house. She recognized several of them as Luther Graves's friends, and at the head of the group, sitting on a big black horse with his face still showing the bruises from Xavier's fists, was Luther himself. "Xavier Kane," Luther shouted. "Come out here. I know you're in there." Violet didn't wait. She flew down the stairs and out into the street, not caring about propriety or safety. Xavier was emerging from the boarding house, and she reached him just as Luther began speaking again. "You've got a lot of nerve, Drifter," Luther said. "Breaking into Harrison Steele's office, stealing his property. That's a hanging offense in this territory." Xavier's face remained calm, but Violet could see the tension in his shoulders. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Luther said with a nasty grin. "Steele came back early from Santa Fe last night. He went to his office this morning and found his strongbox had been broken into. All his important papers were gone. And you know what? Several people reported seeing someone matching your description in that alley last night. You and your saloon girlfriend." Violet's heart sank. Someone had seen them, had reported them to Steele. But who? They had been so careful. "Those papers are evidence of fraud," Xavier said clearly. loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. "Harrison Steele forged documents to steal land from Violet Jameson's father. We took them to expose his crimes." "That's a lie," Luther shouted. "Those papers are proof of legitimate debts. You stole them because you're a thief and she's the daughter of a thief." "I'm not lying," Xavier said, his voice steady. "And I can prove it. Those documents are full of inconsistencies. The paper dates don't match the supposed dates of the loans. The signatures are all in the same hand. Any expert can see they're forgeries." A murmur went through the crowd. People were listening, considering what Xavier was saying. Violet felt a spark of hope. Maybe the truth would come out after all. Then Harrison Steele himself pushed through the crowd. He was a big man, red-faced as Xavier had described, wearing an expensive black coat and carrying himself with the arrogance of someone used to getting his way. "That's enough," Steele said, his voice booming. "This man is a thief and a liar. Sheriff, arrest him." The sheriff, a thin man named Daniels who Violet knew was firmly in Steele's pocket, stepped forward reluctantly. He looked uncomfortable with the situation, but he was clearly going to do what he was told. "Now hold on," said a new voice. Tom Winston pushed his way through the crowd, his weathered face set in determined lines. "I've known Harrison Steele for 10 years, and I've never liked the way he does business. If Xavier says those papers are forged, I believe him. Let's at least look at the evidence before we start arresting people." "This is none of your concern, Winston," Steele said coldly. "It's everyone's concern when a man uses fraud to steal land," Tom shot back. "That affects all of us. If he did it to the Jameson ranch, what's to stop him from doing it to someone else?" More voices rose in agreement. Violet saw several ranchers and businessmen nodding. Not everyone in Deeming was under Steele's control, and some of them were clearly willing to question his methods. Steele's face turned even redder. "Those papers are private property. He had no right to take them, regardless of what they say. Sheriff, I'm pressing charges for theft. Arrest him now." Sheriff Daniels reached for his handcuffs, still looking unhappy but unwilling to disobey a direct order from someone as powerful as Steele. Violet felt panic rising in her chest. They were going to arrest Xavier, and once he was in jail, who knew what would happen? Steele could make sure he never saw a trial, could have him killed and claim it was an escape attempt. "Wait," Violet cried out. "Please just wait a moment. Xavier, where are the papers?" Xavier hesitated, clearly reluctant to reveal the location. If the sheriff confiscated them, they would disappear and the evidence would be lost. "They're safe," he said finally, "in a place where they can't be tampered with." "That's not good enough," Steele snapped. "Those papers must be returned immediately." "They'll be returned to their rightful owner," Xavier said firmly. "Which is the federal government, since they relate to land claims. I sent a telegram to the federal marshal in Santa Fe this morning before all this started. He'll be here within a few days to investigate. Until then, those papers are staying exactly where they are." Steele's expression turned thunderous. "You had no authority to contact the federal government. Any citizen has the authority to report a crime," Xavier countered. "And fraud is definitely a crime, especially when it involves federal land claims." The crowd was murmuring more loudly now. The mention of federal marshals had changed the equation. If the federal government got involved, Steele's local power and influence wouldn't protect him. "This is ridiculous," Luther burst out. "He's just trying to talk his way out of trouble. Sheriff, arrest him already." But Sheriff Daniels was looking uncertain now. Federal marshals were serious business, and if he arrested Xavier before they arrived, he might find himself in trouble too if the forgery allegations turned out to be true. "Maybe we should wait for the marshal," Daniels said slowly. If Kane is lying, the marshal will sort it out. If he's telling the truth, we'll need the marshal to handle it anyway. Are you defying me? Steele demanded. I'm being cautious, Daniels replied, and there was a note of steel in his voice that Violet had never heard before. If you want Kane arrested, get me a warrant from the judge. Until then, he's a free man. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough. Steele looked around at the crowd, seeing the skeptical faces, the people who were questioning his story. He realized he had lost control of the situation. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But if those papers aren't returned, if that marshal finds anything wrong, I'll make sure everyone involved pays the price. He turned and stalked away, his expensive coat swirling behind him. Luther and his friends followed, shooting dark looks at Xavier and Violet. The crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their businesses while talking excitedly about what had just happened. Tom Winston clapped Xavier on the shoulder. That was well played, son. You bought yourself some time. Thanks for speaking up, Xavier said. I appreciate the support. Just telling the truth, Tom said. Never liked Steele, like I said. If you can prove he's been cheating people, you'll be doing this whole town a favor. He tipped his hat to Violet. Miss Jameson, your father was a good man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Violet felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Winston. That means more than you know. After Tom left, Violet and Xavier found themselves alone on the street. The sun was fully up now, promising another hot day. Violet felt exhausted despite the early hour. That was too close, she said quietly. If the sheriff had arrested you. But he didn't, Xavier said, taking her hand. And now we just have to wait for the marshal to arrive. Once he sees those documents and confirms they're forged, this will all be over. Where did you hide them? Violet asked. Xavier smiled slightly. I gave them to Tom last night before I went to the telegraph office. Figured they'd be safer with him than with me, and I was right. Steele can search my room all he wants. He won't find anything. Violet wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Xavier had thought of everything, had planned for contingencies she hadn't even considered. He was protecting her even while putting himself at risk. I don't deserve you, she said. Yes, you do, Xavier replied firmly. You deserve someone who sees how strong and brave you are, someone who will stand beside you no matter what. That's what I'm trying to be. They stood together in the morning sunlight, holding hands, drawing strength from each other. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later, a stern-looking man named William Carter, who had dealt with land fraud cases before. He examined the documents that Xavier and Tom presented, brought in an expert from Las Cruces to verify the paper and ink ages, and conducted interviews with everyone involved. It took less than a week for him to conclude that the documents were indeed forgeries. Harrison Steele was arrested and transported to Santa Fe to stand trial. His lawyer argued that he had been deceived by a clerk who had prepared the documents, but when that clerk was questioned, he quickly confessed that Steele had ordered him to forge the papers and had paid him handsomely for his silence. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and when it was over, Harrison Steele was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud. All the land he had claimed using forged documents, including Violet's ranch, was returned to the rightful owners. Luther Graves and his father tried to cause trouble for Xavier a few more times, but after Steele's conviction, most people in Deeming were unwilling to tolerate their bullying. When Luther picked a fight with Xavier one more time and ended up face down in the horse trough outside the saloon, his father finally decided they had caused enough embarrassment. The Graves family packed up and moved their operations to another territory, leaving Deeming in peace. On a warm day in late June, Violet stood on the porch of her ranch house, looking out over land that was finally, legally hers again. The house needed work, as did most of the outbuildings, but it was home. It was her father's legacy and her future all in one place. Xavier rode up on a beautiful chestnut mare, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life around horses. He had been in town ordering supplies for the ranch, repairs they were planning. But when he climbed the porch steps, he was smiling in a way that suggested he had something more than lumber on his mind. "Close your eyes," he said. "Why?" Violet asked, but she was smiling too, caught up in his excitement. "Just do it. Trust me." Violet closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, hearing the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields that Tom Winston was helping them manage. Xavier's hands were warm as he took both of hers. "All right," he said. "Open them." Violet opened her eyes and looked down. Xavier was kneeling on the porch, holding a small box. Inside was a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small diamond that caught the sunlight and sparkled. "Violet Jameson," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I already asked you once, but I wanted to do it properly. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to express. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and protecting you and building a future with you on this ranch?" Violet was crying openly now, happy tears that streamed down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you so much, Xavier." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply while the sun shone down on them, and the ranch spread out before them like a promise. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the church in Deeming. Tom Winston gave Violet away, and his wife helped her make a simple but lovely wedding dress from white cotton. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. Half the town turned out for the wedding, people who had once whispered about the saloon girl and the drifter, but who now saw them as a symbol of justice and true love. Carl from the saloon was there, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but genuinely happy for Violet. Even Sheriff Daniels attended, having gained some backbone after standing up to Steele and determined now to be a better lawman. The only people notably absent were anyone connected to the Graves family, but no one missed them. Violet and Xavier exchanged vows in front of the whole town, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Xavier kissed her, Violet felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Xavier proved to have a gift for horse training, and they began breeding quality horses that became sought after throughout the territory. Violet managed the business side of things, proving to have inherited her father's head for numbers and planning. They added onto the ranch house, making it bigger and more comfortable. They hired several hands to help with the work, good men who were treated fairly and paid well. The ranch became known not just for quality horses, but for being a decent place to work. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a healthy boy they named Daniel after Violet's father. He had Xavier's dark hair and Violet's green eyes, and from the moment he was born, he was the light of their lives. Xavier was a devoted father, patient and loving, teaching his son to ride almost before he could walk. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Sarah, who had her mother's stubborn streak and her father's easy charm. She grew up running wild on the ranch, as comfortable on horseback as her brother, determined to do everything the boys could do and usually succeeding. Their third child, another boy named Thomas after Tom Winston, arrived 3 years after Sarah. By then, the ranch was thriving, their reputation was solid, and they were respected members of the community. Violet never forgot those dark days working in the saloon, never forgot what it felt like to be alone and hopeless. She made sure to help other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances, offering jobs on the ranch or connecting them with resources in town. She and Xavier became known for their generosity and their willingness to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Their children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the evening air. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and beautiful. "You ever think about that day in the saloon?" Violet asked, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. "When you first defended me?" "I think about it often," Xavier said, wrapping his arm around her. "It was the day my life really began. Everything before that was just me drifting, looking for something without knowing what it was. Then I saw you, saw that you needed someone to stand up for you, and everything became clear." "I thought you were crazy," Violet admitted with a smile. "This stranger willing to fight for someone he didn't even know. But you gave me hope when I had none left. You showed me that there were still good people in the world." "We saved each other," Xavier said. "You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something lasting. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I didn't think that was possible." Violet turned to kiss him, a soft, sweet kiss that still had the power to make her heart race even after 10 years of marriage. "I love you too. Thank you for riding into my life that day. Thank you for defending me." "Your name is safe as long as I'm around," Xavier said, echoing those words he had spoken so long ago. "That was a promise I made, and I'll keep it for the rest of my life." They sat together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Their children came up onto the porch, tired from playing, and climbed into their laps. Daniel told them about a colt he had been working with. Sarah demanded to know if she could have her own horse for her birthday, and Thomas simply fell asleep against his father's chest. This was happiness, Violet thought. Not the absence of problems or challenges, but having someone to face them with. Having a family, a home, a purpose. All of it had started with a cowboy who had walked into a saloon and decided that defending a stranger's reputation was the right thing to do. As the years continued to pass, the ranch grew and the family grew with it. Daniel eventually took over most of the day-to-day operations, proving to have inherited both his father's skill with horses and his mother's business sense. Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who treated her with respect and loved her fiery spirit. Thomas became a lawyer, using his skills to help people fight against injustice the way his parents had. Xavier and Violet grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering with time, but their love never dimming. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family expand and thrive. On a quiet evening in the spring of 1920, Violet and Xavier sat on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. They were both in their 80s now, their movements slow but their minds still sharp. The ranch was still operating, though Daniel ran it now with help from his own children. "We had a good life," Violet said, holding Xavier's hand the way she had done countless times over the decades. "The best life," Xavier agreed. "No regrets." "None," Violet confirmed. "Except maybe that we couldn't have had even more years together." "We've had nearly 40 years, Xavier said. "That's more than many people get, and every single day has been a gift." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set one more time over the land they had fought for and built together. The land that had been stolen and reclaimed, that had witnessed their struggles and their triumphs, that held the memories of their entire life together. When Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months later, Violet mourned him deeply, but also celebrated the life they had shared. She continued living on the ranch for another 3 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and the day he had walked into a saloon and changed her life forever. When Violet's own time came, she went peacefully, her hand held by Daniel with Sarah and Thomas nearby. Her last words were about Xavier, about how she would see him again soon, about how their love had been the greatest adventure of her life. They were buried side by side in the family cemetery on the ranch, under the wide New Mexico sky that had witnessed their love story. The simple headstones bore their names and the words that had started it all, the promise that had defined their lives. Your name is safe as long as I'm around. The ranch continued on, passed down through generations, and with it the story of Violet and Xavier. It became a family legend, the tale of the saloon girl and the cowboy who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful together. It was a story of courage and justice, of standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous, of love that lasted a lifetime. And in Deeming, New Mexico, there were still people who remembered, who told the story to their own children and grandchildren. The story of the day Xavier Kane walked into the Silver Star Saloon and defended Violet Jameson's reputation, changing both their lives forever. It was a reminder that sometimes one moment of courage can change everything. Sometimes standing up for what's right, for someone who needs help, can lead to something extraordinary. The ranch still stands more than a century later, a testament to what two people can build when they face the world together. And though Violet and Xavier are long gone, their story lives on, a piece of Old West history that reminds us that true love and true justice are worth fighting for, no matter the cost.